Okay, good morning, Virginia. My name is Lester Brooks. I teach in the history department at Anne Arundel Community College in Arnold, Maryland.
My name is Susan Firestone. I'm a retired patent attorney and I'm from Fort Wayne, Indiana.
And I'm Tim Moore from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. It's great to be here.
And you are?
Hello, my name is Michael Lindemood, and I'm a senior from Glen Allen High School.
My name is Olivia Travers, and I'm also a senior at Glen Allen High School.
I'm Steele Vantry, and I am also a senior at Glen Allen High School.
Hi, I'm Grayson Goldman, and I'm also a senior at Glen Allen.
Grayson, you have to speak up a little bit.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Not so well.
Mhm.
Okay.
In fact, everybody so far has been very, very soft.
Is this fine? Is this a good volume or still too quiet?
Yeah, we're still having difficulty hearing you. Owen, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Owen Buckenmeyer, and I am also a senior at Glen Allen High School.
Okay, that's good and loud. And your
Yes,
teacher?
good, good.
Oh, and I'm Melanie Covington, and I am also a senior from Glen Allen High School. And with us, we have Skylar Van Valkenburg.
Okay, thank you. Okay, time to go to work. We have Unit 2, question number 2. One founder claimed that representatives should, quote, refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country, unquote. Do you agree or disagree with this claim? What alternative systems of representation were considered by the founders? What alternative systems of representation, if any, should be considered in the 21st century? You may begin.
Before I start, can you hear me now? A little better?
No,
We can't hear anything, Grayson.
still.
Grayson, you might try moving closer to your mic.
Okay. I'll get a little closer. Is this a little better?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Alexander Hamilton once argued against the fact that a numerous representation was necessary to obtain the confidence of the people, claiming this confidence would be gained from the good of the representatives. This illustrates today's debate over the amount of autonomy our public figures should be given. Many argue that giving representatives a larger sphere of representation would lend our system to less bias in areas of concentrated opinion, Madison called fractions.
Wait a minute.
I can't hear anything.
And timer, we have to give them more time, but it's hard to hear you, Grayson.
Should I do his part?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Okay.
okay,
All right. Can we begin?
yes.
Alexander Hamilton once argued against the fact that a numerous representation was necessary to obtain the confidence of the people, claiming this confidence would be gained from the good of the representatives. This illustrates today's debate over the amount of autonomy our public figures should be given. Many argue that giving representatives a larger sphere of representation would lend our system to less bias in areas of concentrated opinion, what Madison called factions. This debate plagued the founding fathers just as it does us. In fact, this caused them to consider and argue for many different representational systems when creating the Constitution.
At the Constitutional Convention, the framers settled their representation debate with the Connecticut Compromise, which gave the established proportional representation in the House of Representatives and equal representation in the Senate. As John Adams said, it is impossible that the whole country should assemble to make laws, so chosen representatives allow for the opinions of constituents to be reflected in government matters. However, they differ in what model of representation they utilize. Those that observe themselves as delegates to the people believe that they are merely empowered to enact the desires of their constituents. George Mason was a strong proponent of this delegate model of representation, as he stated that members of the lower house, quote, ought to know and sympathize with every part of the community.
Contrarily, many members of Congress operate under the trustee model, where their constituents elect them and trust they will make beneficial decisions on their behalf. As Roger Sherman of Connecticut said, quote, "The people should have as little to do as may be about government, because they are constantly liable to be misled." Regardless of the model they employ, chosen representatives allow for the American people to have a say in many of the major decisions made by the government.
Several different forms of representation were considered at the convention, including those named for specific delegates, like the Hamilton Plan, or those created from several delegates of the same state, such as the Virginia and New Jersey plans. Simply put, most large states preferred representation by population, and smaller states preferred equal representation to prevent trampling of minority power. Once the bicameral legislation was settled and agreed upon, delegates then had to debate about the size of each district within each state, determining the number of representatives. The Pinckney Plan proposed a delegate for every 1,000 citizens, but was ultimately weeded out through the debate, in which the delegates decided that a new census would be taken every 10 years to determine district size and representative count for each state. Lastly, there was a debate over the amount of representatives that Congress would host, which eventually was settled on 65 with a room to expand based on Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution regarding the census. However, since 1929, the US population has grown almost 60%, but the number of representatives in the House hasn't increased, leading many to call for increased representatives in the House to reduce the number of citizens a given House member would represent.
In addition, increasing the amount of representatives in the House would allow for a much more representative America. The founders intended for the House to grow with the population and created a baseline of 30,000 constituents per representative, but it is now around 750,000 constituents. A fix for this would be to add around 150 representatives to the House in order to make it the size of roughly the cube root of the population to follow the cube root law, which is what many modern democracies around the world follow, such as Canada, Mexico, and Japan. Another change to make to our current representation system is to maintain our current election system, but make it more representative of the population. An example of this would be through ranked choice voting, where voters rank the candidates in order of choice, thus ultimately electing the candidate that best reflects voter preferences and typically eliminates extremists. This type of voting is already successfully used statewide in Alaska and Maine, as well as at the local level in dozens of other states.
This system of representative democracy has allowed for a simple and effective form of representation for many years in this nation. Models such as ranked choice voting define proportional voting and prove that a chosen body of citizens is an ingenious system of government.
Okay, that was perfect timing. Thank you very much. We will now have some follow-up questions from the judges. Tim?
Sure. I'd like to go to the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debates. Could you summarize for me the Anti-Federalist critique of the representational scheme in the Constitution?
Well, primarily, the Anti-Federalists believe that the greatest governing power should be representatives elected by the people. And however, they thought that representative governments could only work on a smaller scale, like in communities and states, and it would not survive on a national level.
They also feared vague wording in the Constitution, for example, the necessary and proper clause, and feared that the government would be able to increase their power throughout the years, which we have seen through court cases like Marbury v. Madison, creating the concept of judicial review, and McCulloch v. Maryland, which gave Congress the power to establish the national bank.
Olivia, you're gonna have to speak up in the future, okay? Because it's hard to hear you. And Melanie, same thing, it was hard to hear you as well.
Any other thoughts on Anti-Federalist critiques?
Well, the Anti-Federalists pushed for things such as the 9th and 10th Amendments that give unspecified power to the people, and argued against things such as regulatory agencies and executive orders that people nowadays argue are kind of a breach of power of the executive branch.
And like many of the Federalists, they believed that the greatest governing power should be the representatives, but thought that representative governments could only work on a smaller scale, like in communities and states, and they didn't think it would be able to survive on a national level because America was too diverse.
Yeah, I have a question for you on, you brought up the idea of ranked choice voting. How would you institute that throughout the country?
Well, one system of voting that has kind of begun to take place in states like Alaska and Maine is ranked choice voting, which allows voters to rank candidates in the preferred order from first to last. And if one person gets a majority of the first choice votes, they win. If not, the last person is eliminated and the votes for the candidate are reallocated to the second choice of those voters. And Maine's voters approved ranked choice voting, I believe, in 2016, and they used it for the first time in the presidential election of 2020. And states like Wisconsin and Virginia are also heading towards using ranked choice voting because it supports third-party independent candidates, it weakens the power of the major political parties, and prevents a candidate from winning without majority support.
And implementing it, we've also found that it's been seen to increase voter turnout. A recent study, I believe, showed a 10-point increase in voter turnout in parts of the US that used ranked choice voting. And there's also been an increase in voter turnout in the 6 largest cities in the US that use ranked choice voting, including San Francisco, Oakland, and Minneapolis.
You mentioned George Mason, and you talked about his comment about representatives should know and sympathize with the people. Do you see that in existence today in Congress? Do they know and can they sympathize with the people?
Well, I feel as though this issue really comes back to the main debate between what model of representation is best, whether it be the delegate or the trustee model of representation. And most constituents prefer that the person representing them kind of walks the line between the two models. Like, obviously they want their representative to take their interests into account when voting, but should also trust that they will make the best decision on behalf of all constituents, especially when representing a large and diverse population such as we have in America.
And also a change within our history that allowed for kind of a better representation of the people within Congress is the 17th Amendment that made the vote for senator a popular vote rather than a choice of a few elites. So I think that allows for the representation of the people rather than the representation of a few elite white men.
And in more recent years, we have seen examples of representatives who get repeatedly reelected when employing the trustee model versus the delegate model, even after voting differently from what their party believes. And this is seen through Arizona's late Senator John McCain, who operated under the trustee model. And he often went against his own Republican Party, such as voting against Mick Mulvaney as budget chief and voting down the Obamacare repeal. And despite being less aligned with his party, he was still repeatedly elected as senator.
What about, do they really reflect all of society? Do they reflect people who are at the poverty line, the middle class?
Well, when creating the branches of government, the founders wanted there to be a balance between which branches were closest to the people. For example, the House would be the closest, and it would gradually get further away from the people as you get to the judicial and executive branches. However, it can be argued today that the Senate has become too much of an elitist group and doesn't properly represent the will of the people, unlike the House, which is far more diverse and representative of America as a whole. So that kind of begs the question of, is the Senate still in tune with the people? And what reforms, for example, getting rid of the filibuster, could be made to fix the Senate?
And there are arguments that exist that say we should transfer some of the Senate's powers and responsibilities to the House in order to kind of balance that out more. For example, some aspects of the advise and consent of treaties and presidential appointments given under Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution could be transferred from the Senate to the House of Representatives, which, in our opinion, more fairly represents the whole body of people.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'd like to, why did Madison essentially reject this idea of mirrored representation? I mean, did he have good reasons to have suspicions about this?
Well, not necessarily in regards to the legislative branch, but the founders were primarily focused at the Constitution mentioned about the power of the executive branch, and as they had just come off an immensely tyrannical King George III, and they were very worried about the power of the executive branch, so they wanted to make sure they placed strict limits on the power that the president would have.
And it can be argued today that the executive branch is not what the framers intended, as when the writers of the Constitution were initially deciding what powers and responsibilities the executive branch would have. They were heavily influenced by the king and wanted to place strict limits on the power. and that power is drastically different as demonstrated through examples of executive overreach. For example, the president's ability to veto bills granted through Article 1, Section 7 has kind of been abused. For example, Andrew Jackson vetoed a total of 12 bills during his time in office.
Okay. Quickly, have a question. Why did they make the representative districts so large when they were drafting the original Constitution? And 30,000 people, that was a lot.
I think it goes back to simplicity. I think within early America, it was not only important for us to create a good system of representation, but also a system of representation that allowed for quickness and
You may
Go ahead
finish.
and finish your sentence.
that allowed for our governmental actions not to take as long, so that our actual representatives could represent people and create policies and such.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now have some feedback from the judges.
I guess I'll start. I thought your opening statement was very good. I mean, you took us around the world with both historical references as well as some contemporary issues that float around on reforming our system. The follow-ups, I thought you did a good job. I'm intrigued by, well, I will say that some of your history is a bit soft. I thought you could have bolstered your argument with a few more details about anti-federalist critique, about the ratio and comparison to the national legislature to their state legislature numbers of representatives. I think using Madison's vices of the system that he wrote, kind of an internal memo to himself in the spring of '87, might have been helpful in understanding his fear and rejection of this mirrored representation coming out of the states at the time. So your history, I think, could have been a bit stronger. But I think when it comes to the current issues, you shine quite well on the modern present issues. So that's definitely a strength of this presentation. So thank you for your time. And don't worry, Grayson. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, it happens. I enjoyed your presentation too. I would also say that you're very strong in knowing a lot of the current events, and we're able to incorporate those into the presentation. People usually forget that current events do actually show up in Unit 2 a lot. Your ranked choice voting was correct, and it's interesting, and you did get to where I wanted to get to, which was how to implement this around a country. So you did a good job on that. We didn't have enough time to go into why did they come up with that 30,000? I mean, they didn't just pull that out of a hat. That actually, some of that came from the Northwest Ordinance ideas that came out of there. And I was looking for the fact that they did this because these are elitists who don't trust the people. And I think that could have made it a little bit stronger if you worked on that. And it's okay to be strong. So, but don't worry about it. That was just what I was aiming for. So I enjoyed it though.
Okay, a solid introduction where you touched a number of things, the factions, fear factions. You introduced Adams and the idea that you can't gather everyone, and certainly George Mason, as I mentioned before. You talked about the Virginia, New Jersey plan and talked a little bit about that. And then there were a couple of other issues that you touched on, a change, the increase in representatives in the House, transferring power from the Senate to the House of Representatives. Some interesting issues that shows that you've been thinking about these things. 17th Amendment, the change to the popular vote, making it more democratic, the use of McCain. Good job with pulling that together. And as I said, as has been mentioned before, Grayson, don't worry about that. We are in this age of technology, which actually you guys can better handle it than someone like me who really freaks out over technology. So good luck the rest of the way.